So if you're drinking in the corner and you want to come around so you can see the panel, this would be a good time to do so. I'm David Mitchell. I am the Director of Government and External Relations at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Thank you all for joining us for the second event this year in the Research on Tap series. It's a space for drinks, dialogue, and debate about our nation's most pressing economic issues. We've organized this series to facilitate a conversation around evidence-backed ideas and policies that promote strong, stable, and broad-based economic growth, all while having a good time in good company, I hope. So hopefully you've already enjoyed the food and drink. We're especially excited for tonight's program because it celebrates the launch of Equitable Growth's president, CEO, and co-founder Heather Boushey's new book, Unbound: How Inequality Constricts Our Economy and What We Can Do About It. Some of you may have been lucky enough to already grab your free signed copy of Unbound. There's still maybe a few over there, so please help yourself. If not, there is a 4-page summary of the book on each table. I wouldn't say just summary, it doesn't do it quite justice, but it can help you along the way. The book captures what the Washington Center for Equitable Growth is all about, knitting together findings from cutting-edge economic research, much of which Equitable Growth has funded through its academic grants program, to better explain how the economy works and doesn't work for American families. As you'll hear today, the narrative Heather lays out in the book puts record-breaking inequality and issues of distribution at its center, which is in sharp contrast to the dominant approach to the study of economics over the last half-century. For the full story of that history, how the most influential economists during the past several decades ignored and thus exacerbated inequality, I'd highly recommend another new book, The Economist's Hour: False Profits, Free Markets, and the Fracture of Society, which happens to have been written by our moderator this evening, Binyamin Appelbaum. It's almost as if this complementary pairing was thought up by some brilliant Equitable Growth staffer in some back room, but it was not me, I promise. After Binyamin and Heather's conversation, they will be joined on stage by 3 leading voices in economic research and policymaking: Columbia University's Sandra Black, Groundwork Collaborative's Angela Hanks, and Princeton University's Atif Mian. They'll discuss the new consensus emerging in academia, and particularly enlightened policy circles, that reducing inequality is not only fair, but also essential to deliver long-term economic growth and stability. Throughout the program, please feel free to continue to eat and drink. I'd also like to encourage you, if you have a free hand, to tweet, to join the conversation on social media. The hashtag is Unbound Economy, Unbound Economy. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize my colleagues at Equitable Growth who put in a huge amount of work to organize today's event, especially the communications team who are sprinkled out in the crowd. I'd also like to thank the staff here at Ajax, servers, food preparers, AV professionals, for all their work making today's event successful and memorable. Finally, some brief introductions of our first speakers. As I've already mentioned, Heather Boushey is the president, CEO, and co-founder of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. In addition to Unbound, she's the author of Finding Time: The Economics of Work-Life Conflict, and a co-editor of After Piketty: The Agenda for Economics and Inequality. She previously served as chief economist for Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential transition team, and as an economist for the Center for American Progress, the Joint Committee of the U.S. Congress, the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and the Economic Policy Institute, a lot of think tanks. Tonight's moderator is Binyamin Appelbaum, who I've already mentioned. He writes on business and economics for the editorial board of the New York Times. Before joining the board in 2019, he was a Washington correspondent for the Times, covering the Federal Reserve and other aspects of economic policy. He previously worked in newspapers in Jacksonville, Charlotte, Boston, and Washington. The recipient of a Polk Award and a Loeb Award, he has also been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Public Service, and his aforementioned first book, The Economist's Hour, was published earlier this month. All right, with that, Binyamin and Heather, please join me on the stage and take it away.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm really excited to be here this evening. As was mentioned during the introduction, I recently wrote a book about all the things economists did wrong for half a century. And Heather has written what I think is a really exciting book about the way that's changing and the way that economists increasingly are focusing on inequality and its consequences. And I guess maybe the place to begin is just why we think that's happening. What has changed? Why is this new direction in economics emerging?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. And thank you. And thank you so much for hosting this conversation and for all of you for coming. I'm going to kind of try to speak to both sides of the room here. So I think it's changing for a number of reasons. The first one is that over the past few decades, we know that we've seen this rise in economic inequality in terms of income and wealth and rising economic concentration. But we know that because economists now have access to new data that is telling us this story. So in the early years when inequality was starting to rise, economists weren't using, didn't have access to all the different kinds of data, administrative data sources or other sources that we have now. And so that access combined with a lot of methodological work that is brought to the fore, new ways of showing causality, new ways of sort of knowing that this thing causes this other thing, has given economists a new toolbox to see what's happening in the economy. So whereas, I like to think sort of 100 years ago, before we were all using computers and all this data, economists were sitting around drawing their little, what we now call toy models. But now we have all of these tools to come to bear on understanding. And I think over the past 20 years, especially over the last decade, as more and more scholars have been using those tools, they've come to new conclusions. And what we've been trying to do, and what I try to do in the book, is to make sense of that new understanding.
So we've had to live through inequality to learn something about it, and that's a painful way to do it, but maybe there's no alternative. What are we learning?
Well, the big thing we're learning is that one of the things that economists have long been known to argue is that markets work, and that in some sense, if you take an Econ 101 class, you might be taught that markets are perfect, right? You have this perfect competition, and that left to their own devices, markets will create these optimal outcomes. They'll create optimal outcomes in terms of employment and wages and across firms. And what we're learning is that once you disaggregate the data, and once you start looking at studies that allow you to understand what's happening across the income distribution, wealth distribution across firms, that yes, markets can work, but actually inequality has this very, it constrains the economy in a lot of different ways. And in my mind, it's three-dimensional. It's like it's pulling, it's distorting the market, it's creating these subversive forces in terms of how our politics is working. And then what that means is that our lack of attention to the role of institutions that constrain inequality was, I think, the big misguided step we took. And I mean, in your book, and lots of people talk about this, that that's one of the big problems that I think economics is now having to confront, is that when we thought that those institutions that constrained inequality were maybe more of a sideshow, when in fact I think the new research is showing, no, actually those are imperative for having a market that actually works in the way that we think it can and should.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, your book is really well done, but also a little depressing because it goes, from place to place and place. It says inequality is hurting us here, and it's hurting us here, and it's hurting us here. Why was that such a surprise to economists? Why did it take, such a long time to grapple with all of the corrosive effects of inequality?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think, one, nobody likes a downer story. I think there is that. I tried to write a positive book. I spent a year, but it just this is where the evidence led me. I think that we spend a lot of time trying to prove that these negative outcomes aren't what's actually happening, or that a lot of time trying to prove that no, the perfect models we have of how the economy should work or how it actually does work in practice. So I think, for example, about all the research around the minimum wage. So, in the 1990s, I first took my labor economics class in graduate school, and one of the first things that I was taught was this new research by David Card and Alan Kruger that was showing that actually they compared raises in the minimum wage between New Jersey and New York, and they found that, places that raised the minimum wage didn't have the decline in employment that a simple supply and demand model would predict. And that was revolutionary for economists because it undermined this key tenet of how we think about the economy. And I'm going to answer your question, right, which is that one of the things that came out of that, and we did this event with Alan and David a couple of years ago, and David Card talked about that moment and how much blowback he got from the profession and how humiliated he felt. I don't want to put words in his mouth, we can watch the video on that, but as in his description, how he felt when they presented that research at the AAs and eventual Nobel laureates and esteemed people in the profession were like, well, that's impossible because it doesn't fit our theory. And they were using new data, new methods that undermined the prevailing wisdom. And David Card didn't work on the minimum wage since then because there was so much, because it just wasn't being valued in the profession. So I think that part of it is it takes a long time for science to come to terms with what the new evidence is showing us, but I think what we've uncovered, and a lot of the scholars that we work with, is that there is this new, wow, well, okay, we have to change the way we think, but that's hard.
The Times editorial page actually ran a piece in the mid-1980s that said, essentially, we've talked to all the economists, they all tell us the minimum wage law is pointless and we should get rid of it. And it's an amazing piece. And what's so striking to me about that is that if economists then come back and say, hey, by the way, we've looked a little bit more carefully and we've changed our mind, does it get harder? How do you persuade policymakers that this time you're right?
That's a very good question. I mean, to my mind, it seems that having, as you accumulate the weight of the evidence, I mean, it is hard to be constantly confronted by the reality that we can see all around us, that this economy isn't working for the vast majority. We now have all this data. There's this great new data that just the last month or so came out from the Federal Reserve about the rise in wealth inequality. So as we can see that reality, saying, okay, well, what does that mean for our theory? That's the question that we need to push people on. What does that mean for our priors as we're coming to the debate? But I think it's hard to get people to change their minds, right? They took that class, 20, 30, 40 years when they were in college or in high school, and that understanding, well, if prices go up, then people will demand less of it. Which maybe doesn't work. It's hard to get that out of people's heads. And I mean, the other thing too is that I think what we're understanding about the ways inequality affects the economy, it comes down to something that isn't as simple as a supply and demand curve. It does come down to the role, I think, the evidence shows, the role of institutions in constraining inequality. And that's about what people are doing, the kind of institutions we're building, how the laws are being enforced, the regulatory structure. It's more complicated than I think the shorthand for how we've been thinking about economics for the past few decades has been.
Yeah, that story of it's complicated is always a harder sell, right? I mean,
Yeah.
complexity is people prefer simplicity when they can get it. So if people they sit with the book, they read it, what are you hoping they'll take away from it? What are the policy lessons here? What should policymakers be doing differently?
Well, I hope they'll take away from it a few things. First is that there is a really exciting new generation of economists that they should be listening to and talking to for advice. And so I work really hard, and we do every day at Equitable Growth, to try to elevate the research and the voices of this emerging generation of scholars, a lot of whom are doing very serious empirical work. So I hope that they'll be like, oh, I didn't know this person and I want to talk to them. So that seems like one great thing. But then the big policy takeaway, and since I finished the book, I feel like, and kind of ruminating on what I've learned and talked to my colleagues and other people, I think that the big takeaway is that unless we do something to address the subversive aspects of inequality on our economy, in terms of the way that the concentration of resources across firms, is subverting our competitive markets through the increase of monopoly power and monopsony. And until we deal with the subversion of our democracy that we're seeing with money and politics and agenda setting and all that, that understanding that way that inequality is affecting the very way the market works, that's a really big thing to confront. And I hope that policymakers will take on that challenge. The things that I elevated at the beginning of the book about eliminating the obstructions for people to move up and out, those are things that we've been talking about for generations. We haven't been doing enough, but that's, I think, a little bit easier to swallow. But I think really dealing with these subversive aspects is where the real challenge, and my hope that people take that part seriously.
In the course of researching this book, what surprised you most? Where did the research catch you most by surprise?
Well, I'm actually very excited about the panel to have Atif up here because the thing, I mean, I'm trained I do mostly labor economics, social policy issues, and the place that I was not aware of the emerging research is the effect that the rise in inequality in income, and particularly in wealth, has on investment and our overall macro economy. And so the story that's been emerging from this new, this new field that's been using microeconomic data to look at macroeconomic problems, that's very exciting, is helping us understand that intersection. And I think that to me was both new as a researcher. I mean, then the other thing, there's another book out this fall by Thomas Philippon, and he has a number of papers with colleagues where they talk about how the rise of monopolies is actually dampening investment. So we have this long-term sort of secular decline in investment in the United States, and that understanding the role of inequality and the role of the rise of wealth concentration, monopoly in that, that to me seems like a really important thing to understand. We need a lot more research on, I think. I'm curious how the panel goes, but that was someplace that felt new and interesting. That's the penultimate chapter, so if you get that, you can just skip to that one if you're interested. As you look through it.
I mean, it is so striking to move from a time when, not to oversimplify, but a lot of economists basically said, equality is bad for growth, that there's this straightforward trade-off, and, if you are pursuing equality, you will be sacrificing growth. And now the message, I think, of this book is basically inequality is bad for growth. And I guess the question I have is where would you tell policymakers to get started? What is the focus of policymakers? Where should they?
Yeah, so I think I have 3 things plus 1, so it's kind of 4, but I think the plus 1 is just a little one. It's not real, it's big. So the first thing I think that they need to do, if I could wave a magic wand, is I would eliminate our obsession with thinking about aggregate GDP and require that every quarter when we get that BEA, the data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis that gives us the data on GDP, that gives us this sort of overall sense of how our economy is doing, but that is disaggregated, that you see what income growth looks like all across the income distribution. So that I think would be the first thing, but that's sort of the beginning, because it's like, it's easy, we can do it, we can do it. But then I think, you have to think about taxing wealth. We have this enormous increase in wealth inequality. The fact that we have revenues as a share of GDP falling to lows that we haven't seen in decades means that we don't have the resources to make the investments we need. I think you have to deal with the competition issues, and you, in terms of the market structure, and you have to make sure that we are making those investments, especially early in life, they can remove the obstructions for people to move up and out. And then I start the book talking about what happened in Flint, Michigan with lead in the water, and that being, the culmination of an ideology that says we shouldn't be focusing on making public investments. And I point to research by Janet Curry, who's traced what happens to us in the womb to employment and earnings outcomes when we're adults. And so this idea that lead in the water or pollution or the lack of healthcare, or just as importantly, lack of access to childcare and early childhood education, these are things that are going to affect our economy for decades to come. And so taxing wealth, making sure that our economy, that our markets are functioning, and making sure we're making those investments. So those would be the three big buckets I would start with.
I don't want to suggest that Congress can't do more than one thing at a time, but if you
Yeah,
had to
whatever.
pick one.
Oh man.
If I had to pick one, I think I would start with,
It's tough, but I think I would start with raising taxes. Oh wow, there's a cheer to that! Budget guys are happy.
Well, I think we're going to bring some other people on stage now and broaden out the conversation. We've got three guests this evening, and their bios are longer than I can remember, so we're reading. We've got Sandra Black, who recently joined the faculty at Columbia University, where she's a professor of economics and international and public affairs. Previously worked at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, in the Department of Economics at UCLA, and at UT Austin, and served as a member of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. Angela Hanks is the Deputy Executive Director of the Groundwork Collaborative, previously served as Director of the Center for Post-Secondary and Economic Success at CLASP, Director of Workforce Development Policy at the Center for American Progress, and a Senior Federal Policy Analyst at the National Skills Coalition. She was also counsel on the Democratic staff of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, and in LA, which is a job that many in Washington have early in their careers. To Congressman Elijah Cummings, who was fairly early.
Right after law school, first job ever.
That's how many great careers
First job
start.
ever was life-running, but yeah.
And Atif Mian was the John H. Laporte Jr., class of 1967. That's a long time. Professor of Economics, Public Policy and Finance at Princeton University, Director of the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, also at Princeton. Previously taught at Berkeley and the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and is one of the authors of a wonderful book called House of Debt: How They and You Caused the Great Recession and How We Can Prevent It from Happening Again. Highly recommended reading. So thank you, all three of you, for joining us on stage this evening. You are some of the faces of what Heather is describing in her book as a change in economics, in the focus of research, in the level of concern about inequality, and in terms of what you would like to see policymakers do. And maybe we'll start with you, because your work on what we're learning about the implications of inequality for the macroeconomy are really fascinating. Talk a little bit about how that plays through the financial system.
Sure. So first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. I'll give you my version of David Carter's anecdotes, right? So if you look at these two words, equitable and growth, as both of you have mentioned, there is this sense that there is a tension between the two. So there's a theory behind it. So let's think of that theory, that just like this supply and demand theory of minimum wage, there's actually a theory that says there's a tension between the two. So let's think of that about that a little bit more. The notion that there is a tension between equity and growth, one version of the story is that as inequality rises, one very basic fact of people at the higher end of income is that they tend to save more as a fraction of their income. And so as inequality rises, because people at the top save more, when that happens, there are more savings available to the economy for investment. And so the argument is that increase in inequality would raise savings, hence raise investment, which would then raise growth, right? So that's where the idea actually comes from. So now let's investigate it in the David Hart fashion by putting data on this particular theory. The interesting thing here is that when people talked about this, they were really applying this idea to a state of the world which was at a much lower level of development. But we at the book and all of this discussion, we are talking about sort of the modern economy. And the rise in inequality is also this modern post-1980 phenomena that we are talking about. So let's look at evidence from that period, 1980 onwards, and look at the data from the perspective of this particular theory that I highlighted. Now, when you do that, the interesting thing is that the basic premise of the theory is absolutely true, which is that the rich save a much larger fraction of their income That is, people have tested it left and right, and it's one of the, the absolute kind of facts out there. Yet the theory is actually false. So there's something going on there. So what happens when you actually look at the data? What you see is that as inequality is rising, the basic prediction of the theory is that people in the aggregate are now saving more. So investment should go up. But when you look at the data, that has not happened at all. In fact, if anything, investment to GDP actually has gone down over time. So the theory kind of fails in its basic prediction. So what is going on then? If people are saving more, we are taught to believe savings equals investment, so there's something else which is missing here. And that's where finance comes in. What has basically been happening is that this old notion, textbook notion, that savings equals investment is no longer true. That's why there's partly, house of debt and all of that is true. That savings are more and more exceedingly, and that's the financialization of the economy. Savings of the super rich are increasingly being used to finance consumption or demand side of the economy, which obviously doesn't do anything for the future growth of the economy. But there are consequences of that phenomena. So that's exactly what you see. Inequality rises, lower increase in investment. So where are those higher savings going? Well, they're going to fund the lower income consumption essentially, or government consumption, which is kind of the same thing at some level. The problem is that to do that at the macro level, something has to give, because you have to somehow convince people to borrow more and more as inequality rises further and further up. And the only way to do that is to make it more and more easily, quote unquote, easily available. And one way to do that is for the interest rate to keep going down, and that's what we have seen. So that's very much this financialization and sort of the very low interest rate, zero lower bound, or the way that the economy is stuck in is very much directly linked. I want to make that particular connection to this rise in inequality. But then it actually, at that level, it actually starts feeding back, and it actually starts affecting growth negatively. Not just that it's neutral to growth, everything I said so far is kind of neutral for growth, but it starts affecting growth negatively because, for example, very low interest rates start distorting prices. At very low interest rate, you start distorting market competition, because very low interest rate is actually more beneficial to market leaders than market followers. It's kind of a more subtle argument that we made recently, but I hope it's true. So now you get into this negative feedback, and if nothing else, you get into a liquidity trap, which is this idea that if interest rates cannot go down anymore, the economy actually has to shrink to equilibrate savings and their absorption. Anyways, I mean, the basic point I'm trying to highlight here is that this notion that there is this fundamental tension between inequality and growth from a macro perspective is actually no longer true at the macro level.
And I want to pause you on the word data, because one of the things that is important about your work is that rather than sort of the macro data that the previous generation might have used, you and your collaborators have been able to take advantage of very granular data to get a better understanding of financial lives. It seems to me that's part of why you have a new understanding of the role of inequality. So could you talk a little bit about the data?
Yes. No, I mean, data is the king, right? And so that's the advantage of the modern, like I tell my graduate students that, look, think of every economic or financial transaction that you do, these days is recorded somewhere. And so we pretty much have data on everything you can imagine. It's just a question of getting access to it one way or the other. So using that data, it allows you to test these various premises and implications of the theories that we have out there. I'll just give you one quick example. And so you could look in the distribution. So some of the work that I talked about is like you can estimate these propensities to save or propensities to consume of the very rich versus the not so rich. And you can see how they respond to various kinds of shocks. So just to give you one example, the same kind of variation in how people consume and spend matters for how shocks like recessions get transmitted to the economy as well. So if there is a slowdown, it's the more indebted who will also be the less well-off people. They are the ones who are going to respond a lot more aggressively to that shock for every dollar of that shock. And it turns out they also bear a larger share of that shock because they are the indebted ones. And so that's a natural implication of leverage. And so now as a result of this varied response of the rich versus the poor, the economy actually ends up shaking a lot more than it otherwise would have. So you need to take into account in terms of your your policy responses and also in terms of your macro-prudential design of the policy of the economy going forward, you need to take that additional fragility into account. And while you can, let me say one thing, the bias of our policy framework has always been, let's accommodate this stuff. But no one has actually focused on the structural problem, which is, again, this unequal growth or rising inequality. And so while you can keep on it mentally, it's like this classic, the story of the frog who gets boiled, that, it's you, ultimately the structural problem overpowers you, and you have to address the structural problem sooner or later. So we've been kicking this can down the road, but at some point, I think that point is not here, because at some level, interest rates are at zero, so now you have to address this particular problem.
Sandy, one of the things I find deeply unsettling about inequality is that unequal outcomes beget unequal opportunities, beget unequal outcomes. Talk a little bit about what we're learning about that.
So it's interesting when you talk about how we've evolved as a literature and as economists. You used to think of the United States as the land of opportunity, or at least that was kind of the reputation. And then I think, when I think about kind of what's changed, part of it is that there's been data, right? And so now we can see that there is really high intergenerational persistence. And that in itself, may not be a bad thing, or you might argue it's a meritocracy, and so this is how it works. But in reality, when we looked at the research and you see what people have done, when they try to look at the causes of this intergenerational persistence that's huge and highly correlated with growing inequality, you see growing intergenerational persistence, what you see is that when you look at things like wealth persistence, which is wealth is highly persistent across generations. So wealthy parents have wealthy kids, high income parents have high income kids. The research has really tried to disentangle this using kind of these large administrative data sets. And so some of the research that I've done with and others have looked at things like adoptees, where you have kids that are raised by different parents that birth them, and you can actually separate kind of the genetic element from the environment element. And what you see overwhelmingly, particularly with wealth and also income, is that it's opportunity, not kind of some sort of you're inherently better, you're born with these skills. And then you see that what's driving these differences in opportunities is, if you have good parents, you're going to have these good outcomes. And I think Heather's book kind of nicely talks about how, this is something inequality reinforces, that as the wealthy have more power in politics, they kind of reinforce the benefits that they're passing on to their kids and leaving everyone else behind. And combined with that is all the research that shows that policy can be really important in the long run. Like Heather was talking about Janet Curry's work, and lots of people have done work showing that early childhood investments and opportunities really have these long run effects. So I think in some ways this is, the most kind of accepted conclusion in terms of the economic literature, is that these things are really important, that this intergenerational persistence is not an artifact of smart parents have smart kids and they're going to do better, it's a meritocracy, but really that opportunities and resources when you're a kid matter a lot.
Why are we seeing that more clearly now? What has changed?
I think a lot of it is that we have data and that we can actually measure these things, where before you could look, you would have a small sample and you say, oh, we see persistence across between parents and kids, but you couldn't really disentangle what was driving that. And like to do an adoptee study, you need a lot of adoptees, and it's hard to find data where you can observe the parents and the kids. Or you also need to look at kind of long-run outcomes. You need lots of data, and you need a long time period to pass. So this is kind of what you said, you have to live it, and then you learn from that. I think a lot of the research has looked at how the rollout of policies like food stamps and Medicaid have really long-run advantages for kids. And so one of the things that I find kind of just to push the policy dimension a little bit is we know these interventions are really important, but one of the things that I think, and so I think there's kind of unanimous agreement in some sense that this is, this research is pretty compelling. One thing that I think is also really important is that these should be part of a safety net, not part of, we want to help the parents too, right? So that the kids don't need the safety net because the parents' work is paying and they're able to earn a living wage when they have a job, and firms aren't kind of taking advantage of them, which I think our system has moved in that direction.
And John, Grace, from your perspective, does it feel to you like academic economists are regaining touch with reality, or are they transforming your understanding of reality? What does it look like?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting what Sandy just mentioned about sort of people thinking about America as a meritocracy. And one thing that I think is really a real impediment to our ability to move past sort of the conservative or dominant neoliberal economic framework is that it plays into American mythology around sort of like what it takes to be successful in this country, right? That narrative doesn't incorporate misogyny, it doesn't incorporate racism, it doesn't talk about class or power, and those things are real in our society. We know that they're real. And so as I think about the contribution of Heather's book and all the research in it, it really is providing a lot of backup to the things that I think a lot of us in the policy community know and have been working on for a long time, and the folks up here have been working on for a long time, know to be true about how the economy works, how people's lives work, how systems and structures work and affect people's day-to-day. And so I find this to be something that's really useful to sort of amplify and back up something that we've kind of always inherently known.
Where do you feel like we lack clarity? What are the questions that you feel like you need help in answering and understanding?
So I think one of the things that I found very compelling, and I will just, as Atif already talked about it in great detail, but as I was reading this, as I was reading the book, I like in all caps in one section wrote down around this concept of wealth inequality being so bad that the rich are saving and not investing, is that like rich people, we have created an economic system where rich people are so rich, they literally have more money than they know what to do with, and because they're taking it from the rest of us, and we all suffer for that, including them, makes our economy worse off. And so I think the contribution that like, it's not that progressives or folks who are trying to have more inclusive or expansive policies are just right morally, the economics are also on our side as well. And so that is, again, it sort of bolsters this argument that we do need to do things differently. We do need to talk about structural change. We do need to fundamentally change the way our economy works, or else we will all be worse off.
So like Scrooge McDuck with that swimming pool full of gold coins, just using it to go surfing around.
I mean, truly, it's like, it is powerful imagery, but at some level it's like kind of true. There probably is one of those somewhere, who knows? But really, I mean, it is both that economic inequality is bad for human beings, for people, for our families, for your families, but it's also that it's bad for our broader economy. Our economy is not doing well if we're not all doing well. An economy cannot be strong if we're creating all of this wealth and it's only going to the top. That is not a strong economy. And one thing that we need to do is sort of disabuse folks of that notion that the economy is great because the stock market is soaring and GDP is very high. It's like, well, how are people doing? Not so well, right? Like, that should be the measure by which we're assessing whether or not the economy is working.
Heather, it was asserted in the introduction that there's now a consensus that inequality is important. I wonder if you feel that way. Do you feel like that argument has been won and now we're just talking about the consequences?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I'm curious to know whether people are, people around the room. It seems to me, and I think Sandy, said this, in the areas around early childhood, I mean, there is, I think, among economists, definitely a consensus about what that research says, and that change has happened over a relatively short period of time, and which I think is very remarkable. But in the policy sphere, I think that the message hasn't gotten out yet to the extent that we would like it to. One of the things that we keep seeing is that there is, we are seeing a lot of appetite, and it's just saying, we work with Angela and her organization, that there is a lot of appetite for this, for understanding what's really happening in our economy and what policymakers can do about it. But you are up against this idea, we just saw it in 2017, that we just yet again passed a very large tax cut, primarily aimed at those at the top of the income ladder, with the stated policy goal that that was going to improve economic growth, while at the same time starving the government of resources that they needed to make the kinds of investments that Sandy was talking about, and no recognition of anything that Atif mentioned at all. So I think among some people, there's a growing sort of awareness that how that translates into a broader understanding of what this evidence shows us, I think, is the challenge in front of us.
That is curious, yeah.
I just wanted to pick up on what Heather said. I think that's exactly the challenge. It's not that the economic side is struggling with whether inequality matters or not, or things like that. The real puzzle is a political one. And it's a puzzle of, you could call it communication or something to that effect, which is that the people are voting against their economic interests. That's another way of saying the same thing. Like if you look at the population, and so whether it's appeal to racism or xenophobia or something like that, that is being mixed in the pot to make them vote a certain way. But on economic grounds, this message that sort of we are distilling on the academic side, it's not getting through to the voters in the numbers that it should to make a political change. And that's, to me, as an economist, obviously that's a puzzle, but then there are other things I don't understand, so I'm happy to like why is there this communication failure?
But it seems like the wealthy control the political narrative, so it seems like they kind of, there's wealth is affecting the politics, and so if they're the ones who are saying what's going on, then people hear that. That's what people hear.
So, but talking about your own experience with that, when you're working in the White House and your job is to bring academic ideas into a policy context, do you feel like you are inhibited in your ability to do that?
I mean, I think one of the things that I saw is just that a lot of what we were doing is very incremental, right? So it's a lot of incrementalism and it's hard, I think, because a lot of the research is incremental. So I was talking to people about what you would do to improve wages for working people, and the minimum wage is something people bring up in the EITC, and it's because that's all we have to look at, that's where the evidence is, and so things like, making unions bigger or promoting wage boards or these kind of bigger ideas, we just don't have a lot of evidence. And so it feels like sometimes you get in your own way, because if you just if you limit yourself to exactly what you know, you're limited, right? And so you're moving on these relatively small margins, and so in some ways it's hard as academics, I think, to think big, because we want to know, but if you don't have the evidence, so now you have to think, well, how do I get evidence? Where is the evidence going to come from? Maybe I have to try something, I don't know how it's going to work, and see what happens. But I definitely felt in the White House that you're limited by, well, there's also what politically you can do, but economists aren't very good at that part. So.
Talk a little about, to take a specific example of this, the literature on monopsony, the idea of, I'll let you describe it, but basically, I think this is a fascinating example because it's an area where the Obama White House actually sort of did play the role of saying, we don't totally know what's going on here, but this is important and people should be paying attention to it.
Yeah, so that was kind of the coolest thing I did, I think, and I have to say, Laura Giuliano, who was the senior economist who worked on that, really was the spearhead of that, so I don't want to take credit for her work. But it was this idea that most economists, as Heather pointed out from the very beginning, we assume that markets are perfectly competitive, and so every worker is being paid what they produce, right? The margin, the value of what they produce, and so it's all fair, right? You produce something and you get paid for it, and everything is good. And so, and this is a very old idea, the idea that markets aren't perfect, and that firms actually have power and don't have to pay workers their marginal product. And so it's an incredibly old idea, but not very popular, especially among labor economists, which is what I am. And so while we were there, we put out an issue brief, and that's really all we did. We didn't actually do anything except write up an issue brief that described how this is much more consistent, this idea that workers aren't benefiting from their labor, that they aren't earning what they're producing, that in fact the firms are extracting this, and that's why you see the firms doing so well and the workers doing so badly over time. And so it's so interesting because when we put that out, people paid attention and people joked to me that it was the first time they heard this word monopsony, which is really just the idea that firms have power, have market power over workers, and can keep wages lower than they would otherwise have to in a competitive market. But so after that, I asked economists at the White House and said, so do you really think that labor markets are perfectly competitive, that the wage is actually your marginal product? And almost everyone said yes, that this is still like, we just don't like letting go of this, even though it seems completely crazy if you think about it from a normal person's perspective, which is like, oh, if you pay me 5 cents more, I'll leave my job now and go over there because that 5 cents is costless in this perfect world. And in reality, that's not at all true, and it's hard to move jobs, and all jobs are not equal, and things like that. So I think, yeah, it was really interesting. It was interesting and in some ways heartening that actually picked up some steam.
It is, that deeply held idea, though, that markets work like that. I was reading a paper today about Oregon has this law banning non-compete agreements, and when it was passed, some economists predicted that you would actually see wages fall because people were shortly being compensated for signing non-compete agreements. I actually got a federal judge write this into an opinion that educated them.
Which is crazy because half of the data show half the people don't even know they signed a non-compete agreement.
Right.
So they're just, yeah.
But that disjoint between theory and policy,
Exactly.
and how do you sort of approach that translation problem? Like when you're starting to see evidence that monopsony is real and that, if there's only 2 places to work in a town, it's going to be harder to get a raise. How do you translate that into policy? Where do we go from there?
I think that this is where the data can be really helpful in terms of thinking about how much it reflects real people's lives. Like as you're giving the example of someone changing jobs for a 5-cent raise. Are you gonna get sexually harassed on that job? Are you gonna have protections on that job? Is it close to your kid's childcare center? All of those things are questions that people are making every day, that the theory of a rational person would just leave their job if they can make 5 cents down the street doesn't actually play out. And so it's helpful to be able to say not only is that not true, but we can demonstrate that through using data and doing more sophisticated analysis that these folks can explain better than me. So I think that is incredibly helpful. I think the other thing that this does is, a real challenge. I think we are both optimistic and pessimistic on this. A real challenge that we have is that because I don't think we've sort of been able to communicate the magnitude of the problem, we have not developed commensurate solutions to address it, right? So we have this massively unequal economy that perpetuates racism and sexism and all of these things that we know are bad, we know don't really work out for people, and to Heather's point, also don't work out for the broader economy, right? It doesn't translate into more growth or productivity. It just means that we're all worse off, but we're hanging on to this mythology. So I do think that there is some real challenges there, and sort of, if that is the scope of the problem, what are the solutions? And so in some ways, it's this is why we're in this moment that Atif talked about, where people are talking about free college and Medicare for all and all these big things, the Green New Deal, and that's great. But then the pessimism comes in when you're watching the debates, and it's the conversation about Medicare for all is not what does the system look like that provides healthcare for all people? It's well, how would you pay for it? It's if that is where the conversation is, and we can't even talk about the policy, we can't even talk about sort of what the magnitude of the problem is we're trying to solve, we have a real uphill battle. So I think the thing that we can do on policy is really define the problem in a way that accurately reflects real people's experiences, the actual economy that we have, not the one that we think we have or the one that we dreamed that existed, and develop policy solutions that actually meet that call.
This is a good job.
Yeah, I think even listening to this conversation, one of the things that strikes me as I'm listening to the political debate, right, is that we tend to have these conversations we're having these conversations at these outer bounds, right? It's market or state, right? And I think that when you look at the evidence, it's neither, right? It is that markets are created by humans and that there's rules and these are to suit human needs. And that this space in the middle, which is harder to, it's not this sort of extreme pole where it's one or the other and you can just like clearly demarcate it. This place in the middle, which is, I think, not where economists are comfortable sitting in as much, thinking about the state side, the institutional side, the questions that maybe are better, the sociologists or the political scientists, these other places. How do we push the policy conversation to be more in that place? I mean, because you could hear it in the debate. Well, I mean, how are we going to pay for Medicare for all? And then, many of us are sitting going, well, but we pay more per person in healthcare than any other developed country, so we are paying for it, but it's about who, because you've said that markets and state are different rather than this is a problem with how people are accessing this healthcare, and that, I mean, at some level, paying for it. I mean, you're paying for it either way, right? Does it matter if you write the check to an insurance company or the government? Obviously it matters, but on some level it doesn't for the person who needs the care. But so that question is where, I don't know, is this gonna come out the right way? I feel like in some ways the book is a little bit of a plea for help from other disciplines to come in and sort of like, here's what economists are learning and where we need to be thinking about what kinds of institutions, what kinds of market rules, how we think about how economic power translates into social and political power, that we need to be putting those pieces together. And I'll just say one more thing on this is, I'm sure you thought about this in your book. You think about sort of how we got here, which again is what your book is about, and sort of this idea that markets alone are this utopian idea that there's this thing out there that we can just let it do all the work for us and we never have to think about distribution or fairness because markets are fair. And coming to terms with the idea that it isn't inherently fair unless we make sure that it is, that feels like the big leap we need to make in our policy, but it's bigger than just economics, although I think we have so much to offer in terms of the research and evidence.
Yeah, the idealization of the market, that's something that exists outside of government and into which government intrudes, I think is a very fundamental problem. And it's something I want to ask you about because it sometimes feels as if this research often takes the form of saying, okay, in this area we can find an imperfection in the market, in this respect the market is imperfect, but the market as a concept endures despite all of that. So do you think that you can win the necessary sort of reconceptualization without having a new macroeconomic framework? Does this debate have to happen at the level of saying, we need a new paradigm?
I think it is important to put a new paradigm out there for one basic reason, which is that if you think of the nature of the debate right now, it's become very ideological. And so there is this notion put up by one side, which doesn't want to talk about inequality as much, that there is a paradigm out there that you must respect, because, and again, that is this notion that markets can solve everything and they can exist on their own without thinking about the micro foundations of markets and so on. So I think for all those reasons, we do need to communicate that actually the correct paradigm is somewhat different. And I kind of like the way Danny Roderick, for example, talks about it, that it's more nuanced, that you have to, there are certain principles that we can take with us, but then you have to look at each individual problem that comes to you and not, this is the important thing, not take as given that the solution is just the paradigm. And so I think that, so it's important whether what you construct as an alternative or you're unable to construct, that's fine, but I think it's at least important to deconstruct that notion that there is this one paradigm out there that somehow is legitimate. Because we need to move the debate forward. I think that's one of the issues I talked about earlier as well. This what I was saying is a puzzle is that the debate seems to be stuck. That there is a side that is not willing to reason at some point. And that feels, at least to me, feels frustrating.
And so are there lessons that politicians can teach economists in that respect? Are there lessons that should be brought back in the other direction?
maybe this is unsurprising, but I don't think that there's like an equal amount, there might be an equal amount of resistance on both sides. I don't think there's an equal amount of power. One of the sort of advantages that the folks who are sort of have faith in this more market-dominant economic system have is that like that is the system that we all recognize and understand and think about without even really thinking about in our daily lives, right? So like this is how we think about people on the streets, how they think the economy works. It probably is some combination of like cutting taxes for rich people and we'll all figure it out or whatever. And so I think the thing that we're up against is that the kind of emerging paradigm that Heather writes about is still emerging. And so I think politicians need to be with economists, with policy folks, with other people who are sort of making this, with activists, making this transition to thinking about what is the economy that we want, what does it look like, what are we valuing, what are we measuring, how are we assessing it, and moving more in that direction.
Because when I think about kind of when we talk about the extremes in the US, the extreme left here is embracing policies that many, many other countries are already doing. Like, you know, this Medicare for all idea is not a crazy idea. Other countries do it. Paid leave for families. These are all policies that are not extreme policies. In fact, we're the aberration that we don't do them. So I think that's something I always try to remind myself, because when you see it on TV or something, it seems like these are like crazy out there. How are you going to pay for these crazy policies? How are you going to implement a wealth tax? Like, lots of people have already done this. There are lessons to be learned, and these things are doable.
Heather, I'm fascinated with this. You mentioned it in passing, but one of the things you argue for in your book is that we should be less focused on GDP and more focused on the distribution of growth. That's a conceptual shift that I think has the potential to have real power. It reframes the discussion. Talk a little bit about the importance of that.
Yeah, it's something that I think is really exciting. The first year that Equitable Growth, well, maybe this is the second year that we were around, it was the second year, went to the ASSA meetings and was on a panel with Gabriel Zuckman. And he presented this research where they had taken the National Income and Product Account data, which is where we get gross domestic product, and they had taken the accounting data on how much our economy produces, and they'd appended the tax return data so you could see who the income went to. So all of when the U.S. economy produces output, all of that output is sold to somebody, it's income for someone. And so who does that go to? So we showed this chart of what that looked like across the income distribution. And just to summarize it, this is a research on tap, so we don't get tap slides. But if I did have slides, I would show this one, which is that from over the 60s and 70s, growth was about 1.7, 1.8% on average over those decades. And the vast majority of Americans saw their incomes grow at that level. And if you were poor, your income grew more, and if you were rich, your income grew less. And so they were able to disaggregate. They showed the aggregate income growth and then what it looks like for all the people. And then you fast forward from 1980 to the most recent data, which I believe is 2016, and the story is just so remarkably different because everybody below the 90th percentile has income that is below the average. So you go from a country where we all are growing together and we're growing at this, this fairly steady clip, to a country where growth is slower and it's only going disproportionately to those at the very top. But that story, being able to see that, you've done a mock-up of what the Bureau of Economic Analysis quarterly GDP release would look like if you showed that disaggregation, so that you could see quarter by quarter who that money is going to. I think that would change our national conversation. I want to stress that it doesn't solve all the problems, right? And it doesn't get at the wealth issues, it doesn't get at what we really value, which is well-being. Growth and output is just one piece of the puzzle, but it would really help us understand that, Angela said that, it's so interesting to see this coming together of what Angela said, that when the economy does well, it's because all the people are doing well. And we've been told this story for a long time that, well, you do that through giving the money to the rich people, through cutting taxes for the wealthy or for allowing inequality, but that doesn't actually work. And being able to actually in real time connect those dots to understand what it is that you're working towards that feels enormously powerful. And so Gabriel's been working with Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez to put this data together, and we do a lot of work with it, or you can go to annual economic meetings and meet them and see their research. That's just a plug for the AA.
And maybe the place to sort of wind this down is how we get started. I've asked Heather already what she would do to begin addressing these problems. We ask each of you. You get into the room with the policymakers and they ask you, okay, we accept it, you're right, inequality is a problem. How do we begin to address it?
I think the broad level and the details can be done in different ways. You know, I like to think more at the macro level first because I'm not very good with details. But I think at the macro, the basic point is the following: that endowments matter, and you have to provide equitable endowments, and that's really the key. Now, figure it out. I think we need to have an agreement that that's true.
Just because people have been drinking, could you say what endowments are?
So, and endowment basically, you know, the idea is that resources that you have available when you grow up, those aggregate resources really matter in terms of your eventual productivity, your labor market outcomes. You know, Heather mentioned Curry's work and so on. So, so it's really important that all households, all children growing up have those endowments, those resources to be able to have the education they deserve and to have the health care that they need and so on. And so that's the structural shift that we really need. And again, from a macro perspective, partly answering this GDP question, I think there are a couple of statistics that we must have mandate that we will track on a distributional level. And so, for example, like what's happening to income mobility. I think we should aspire as a country, as a nation, that this notion of land of opportunity should be very real, and we should actually track it. So this is sort of the stuff Rajari and others have done. I think it should be institutionalized. We should be tracking it in terms of income mobility. We should be tracking it also in terms of what's happening to people's health and standard of living. The one single statistic that really is sort of hits against the line of GDP is to look at life expectancy and what has happened to life expectancy for a subset of people in the US, and it's really sort of sad and depressing. This is not acceptable, and then figure out how to have those endowments and allow people to live their lives.
Angela?
There are many policies, and I won't give you a list of policies, but what I would say is one way to think about, as you're thinking about what are the policies that would do it, I think a useful rubric that we've been talking about and other folks have is sort of the policy should, we're talking about an outsized amount of inequality, which means an outsized amount of power at the top. So one thing those policies should do is curb and address private power, should also expand public power and public investment. And then the third thing, which is really crucial, is it has to be inclusive and equitable. We can't have an economy that is maybe less unequal than the one we have now, but there are still big race and gender disparities. And so really, I think if you're thinking along those metrics, policies that address inequality should, at some level, do all of those things.
But what does that mean in practice? Where would you aim?
Yeah, I can tell you, I think, that's a good example. I won't use Medicare for all because we've already used it, but I'll use for college instead. So this is an area where there is a huge amount of power that exists outside of the kind of people who attend college, the people who pay for it, the people who pay back their student loans, the people who, and so making, decreasing that power and giving more power and creating more public investment so folks are spending less out of their pockets for school, they're able to be less constrained when they go out into the labor market, and then doing so in a way that addresses race and gender equities along the way.
Sandra?
I want to go with her.
You're all on the endowments, so you're all in favor of sort of dealing with this primarily by increasing opportunity rather than by, Heather's answer is she wants to start by taxing people.
I think that first one is really important. Curbing private power is about creating a set of rules by which the private industry market have to abide. I think that is a huge part of this. I don't think it's just expanding public investment because government by itself is not just like objectively good. The reason why I'm talking about public power instead of sort of expanding government is like government can also be a tool for press. I mean, like we are keeping people in cages right now as a function of government. So I don't think it's just sort of expand this one area. It really is think about the rules of the road, expand what works, expand what helps people, and do so in a way that's inclusive.
And I think, Heather, I noticed in your book, I thought it was really interesting how you point out that the inequality leads to, wealthy having a disproportionate amount of power making the rules of the road, and so I think that's kind of, you need to take that away so that everyone has a say in what's going on.
Heather, am I wrong in thinking that they're taking a different approach than you were advocating a few minutes ago?
They are?
Yep.
I think, I'm not gonna disagree with them. But I mean, I think that it's interesting, so Atif talked about endowments. My point about how we needed to raise taxes at the top is how we equalize those endowments. So there's two, it's like you can equalize them either by giving people something or a bit, but on some level you have to unpack what's at the top. Get rid of the opportunity hoarding at the top, either through raising taxes or some other way of changing that scenario. So it feels to me that these go together, and I think seeing them as two sides of the same pull and push is what I think is really important. And I do think it's important that we recognize that there is both public and private power aspects that we need to think about here. And I'm also just really glad that Angela mentioned that these have to be inclusive, and that has to be, and I think that sort of undergirded a lot of this conversation as well.
That's great, thank you. You want to?
I just want to say one thing, which is the non-economic side of it. I think on policy side, I think the rate of incarceration in the US is unacceptable. And I think it goes. I think there's something to be said about the way the criminal justice system is designed in the US. It should be based on the principle of reforming people, not sort of randomly punishing people. And it's really gone to a sort of different scale again when you compare it. So I think that's very important.
Well, that gets to the private power. There's a lot of money interest behind that policy, so connecting those dots. So, but I think just to re-answer the question, I think what I'm doing is that we're trying to reshape the way we're thinking about that policy agenda, and so hopefully this is giving people some ideas.
So wrap this up for us. What have we?
So I have a couple of notes.
Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, just a couple of notes as I wanted to make sure. So I wanted to just go thank all of you for joining here this evening, and also all of you. So we launched Equitable Growth in 2 months. It'll be 6 years ago. And the book is really a summary of what we've learned, and it required the support of almost everybody on my team, and I've seen a couple of former staff people here who helped a lot. For what we've learned from all of these the scholars, the research, we've given away over $5 million to over 200 people that have all informed this work, and so we're very grateful for that opportunity and the opportunity to share our findings with you here this evening. But I want to stress that we see this as the start of a conversation. I think if there's anything that's come out of this discussion here this evening is that we have a long way to go. And so I both encourage you to hang out this evening. There's open bar and food. Please hang out, and we'll be here and you can talk to us. I'll be here for however long. We hope to come back with many of you again in November as we talk about our policy agenda. We'll be doing a conference on November 1st. But we want to keep pushing on these questions and where the research leads us. So thank you all.
Thank you.